Great to see everyone here. My name is Frank Gavin. I'm the director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center of Global Affairs at SAIS Johns Hopkins. Absolutely thrilled to be here with my great friend Janice Stein, who both created and runs the Munk School at the University of Toronto. And we have an amazing panel here to talk about a very important subject involving the war in Ukraine. A couple weeks ago, Adam Entous published an extraordinary piece in the New York Times, The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. And we just happen to have perhaps the best group of people to discuss some of the things that were revealed in that article and to think more broadly about how we should be thinking about the origins, consequences, course of the war and where it's going. So I'll make some brief introductions and then we'll get started. We have Ian Martin, who is a longtime columnist for the Times and has done an extraordinary job creating two really important initiatives. One, Engelsberg Ideas, which I'd recommend everyone to go to EI to see the amazing stuff they're publishing, and also the London Defense Conference, which is becoming the premier gathering globally for people to discuss international security issues. We have John Bew. John is an award-winning historian, and he's also, over the last 5-6 years, served as a very close advisor in number 10 to 4 different prime ministers, while also running the Grand Strategy Program at King's College London War Studies. Sergei Radchenko. Sergei, also a renowned historian, and he's the reason we're all here, because he is the Lionel Gelber Prize winner, which is the most important distinguished scholarly award for books on international relations. His incredible book, To Run the World, is the winner this year. And I'd highly recommend everyone go out and get it. We have joining us on Zoom Colin Kahl. Colin is a renowned scholar who is at the Freeman Spigoli Institute at Stanford University, but for the purposes of today, was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Pentagon when many of these important events we're going to talk about took place. And of course, our host today, the great Janice Stein, who is the first person I'm going to ask a question to. Could you set the stage for us and explain why this piece is so important?
Thank you so much, Frank. When I read the piece, I was, first of all, gripped by the narrative. And what stood out to me was the detailed discussions among the people on the ground, at the front lines. It's very, very difficult to get a really granular sense of these kinds of conversations as decisions are being made. I'm probably going to challenge the historians by saying a lot of that doesn't make its way into the archives. So what struck me about the piece was how important what you, Frank, call contemporary history is to our understanding. History gets rewritten, as you've said, every 10 years because we rewrite history from the perspective of the present looking back. Frank did a lovely piece about the history of the Cold War. He took it through 10-year cycles and showed us how it changed depending on each decade and what you were seeing. But here, we have living contemporary history because it's in our own times, and that it is not only contemporary history, it's a particular kind, which we might call ethnographic history. It's history from the ground up, and it raised so many interesting questions, and I think John and Colin will help us understand how much of what Anton heard did you hear when you were making important decisions, because there's always a gap between what policymakers are hearing and what's happening on the ground. It was absolutely striking. You know, Frank asked each of us, what's the one thing that stood out? For me, it was the incredible on the ground, real-time intelligence that was provided through American and Ukrainian cooperation in a base at the level of generals, but it was targeted. It was targeting information. My favorite phrase in the article was the decision not to use the word target. It was points of interest, so that if they were asked, they had plausible deniability that they were not assisting in identifying Russian targets. Why? And that raises some of the biggest issues in the article. So I'm going to stop there, but I think it's a remarkable piece for students, for policymakers, to understand how important multiple perspectives on the same thing is.
So it's an absolutely great point. And one thing I forgot to mention in doing the introductions, Janice is so distinguished. She's written, I would say, the best piece on thinking about escalation dynamics during the war, Learning by Doing, which was in Texas National Security Review, and I think is exactly an exercise in what we're talking about, trying to understand events as they're happening, making sense of it, looking to the past, seeing the present, which we have a great panel to do this because we have two historians, an international relations expert, and a journalist, and so each of you have your different lens, and another international relations expert. But two of you here are both great scholars, but participated in constructing this policy. And so I'm going to turn to you first, Colin, and the question I've asked everyone is that question of what about the conventional wisdom that you encounter out there is perhaps most needing of updating, correcting, because you were there, you saw it, you constructed much of the policy, as did John. But I'd also, I think, after you answer that, how you think about your role both as a scholar and a participant. It's a similar question that I'll give to John about how you went back and forth in your mind thinking about that. But first, to sort of your general reaction to the article and what people get most wrong.
Sure. So, Adam Entos is one of the best investigative journalists in Washington. He's not as well known as some, but he's extraordinary. I think he worked on that piece for more than a year. He's got great contacts in the intelligence community and the Defense Department and in Ukraine and in Europe. So, I think it's a highly credible piece of contemporary history, as Janice pointed out, and it tells a piece of the story that had been understood at the edges, but not in the granularity that Adam tells it. And I'm obviously going to be personally careful about not confirming or denying any particular piece that might speak to kind of classified things. But I think the broad strokes of the article resonate with my experience. So, just for the listeners, I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the lead up to and in the 2 years follow, the year and a half that I had left in the job after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And so kind of had a front row seat for this as the principal policy advisor to the Secretary of Defense. I think there are a couple of things that people get wrong, especially the Washington establishment consensus around Ukraine, especially about the Biden administration's response in the early years of the war. The first thing they get wrong is that we left a bunch of cash on the table. We weren't willing to provide the Ukrainians what they needed. We didn't get it to them fast enough. That there's all this magical thinking that we had unlimited amounts of money and there were no trade-offs involved. When I was undersecretary, I signed off on every single security assistance package to Ukraine. I oversaw personally $43 billion of the $60+ billion that we provided to Ukraine. So I was intimately involved in every single security assistance package. We didn't have $43 billion on the first day of the war. We didn't have $60 billion on the first day of the war. In the first 6 weeks of the war, which I would argue were the most important period of the war, because that was the period where the Russians were defeated in their effort to change the regime in Kyiv and pushed back from Kyiv. Had the Ukrainians lost it in the first 6 weeks, the war would have been over. So the war has basically almost been frozen in place since then. So what did we have to play with in the first six weeks of the war? We had $3 billion. Okay, we could have given them the things that everybody talks about, the fancy whiz bang stuff. We could have given them a Patriot battery. You know how much that costs? $1 billion. $1 billion. So 1/3 of the $3 billion. You know how long it takes to get there? 10 weeks. That's outside the 6-week window that I talked about. Plus, you got to train them. They don't know how to use them. It's only one battery. It doesn't actually deal with the threats. Or I could recommend to the Secretary of Defense that we spend that $1 billion on Stinger missiles to actually shoot down Russian aircraft and Russian helicopters. Okay, I could have given them tanks and Strykers and Bradleys and all these things we gave up. That would have been another $1 billion. And they didn't know how to maintain any of those things. They wouldn't have gotten there in time, and they weren't relevant to the particular fight. Or we could spend that same $1 billion on Javelin anti-tank missiles that they actually used to defeat the armored columns of Russians coming down the road. Or we could have provided them advanced missiles, HIMARS systems, ATACMS, all the advanced Western artillery. Again, it would have taken them a long time to get there. And frankly, what they needed was resupply for their Soviet-era ammunition and artillery, which is actually what they used once they got the Russian convoys stopped on the roads to decimate the Russian army. So there is this magical thinking that like we held all this stuff back and that there were no trade-offs. At every piece of the war, at least as the conversation was happening in the Pentagon, we were trying to figure out what did the Ukrainians need right now? What could they use right now? What could they be trained on or were already trained on? What was imperative for the fight right now? And of course, there were things the Ukrainians asked for that they didn't get, but that's because they asked for everything, because they were in an existential fight. So thing one is that we left a bunch of stuff on the table and we weren't prioritizing what they needed. That's just not true. And as the war shifted after the Battle of Kyiv was settled in Ukraine's favor, we then shifted towards Western-style artillery and then the HIMARS rocket systems that the Adam Entos piece talks so much about. So that's thing one. Thing two is that the primary thing that was driving our decision-making were escalation considerations. Escalation considerations did matter. It mattered for how we conducted our activities and in ways that were not as overt and escalatory as they might otherwise have been, and the Entos piece speaks to that. But mostly what we provided was not driven by escalation concerns, but basically what we had on the shelf, what we could provide, how we could get it there in time, and also, frankly, as the United States looked at its global commitments, where it would undermine our readiness to provide them certain things when we have other wars to deter and potentially other contingencies to deal with. And then the third thing was that escalation was the third piece of magical thinking is that escalation didn't matter at all. So I don't think escalation dominated our decision making. There were a couple of moments, I think early in the war, for example, when Zelensky asked for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. We said no because that would have meant going to war with Russia, because we would have had to bomb Russia's air defense systems in Ukraine and in Kaliningrad, and potentially in Russia itself. That would have been World War III. So the no-fly zone, that certainly escalation dynamics were there. I think the decisions about long-range missiles, escalation dynamics loomed over that for much of the war. But for most of the other systems, it wasn't about escalation. But that doesn't mean we didn't have to think about escalation. The Russians, when they went into Ukraine, devoted 90% of their army into Ukraine. The wide expanse of Russia was wide open to conventional threat, and Putin was engaged in all sorts of signaling to dissuade any actors from taking advantage of that opening. But more importantly, in the fall of 2022, and happy to talk about this in greater detail later, in the fall of 2022, when the Russians started to lose and were in particularly dire straits, where they got kind of rolled back in the north in a place called Kharkiv, and where the Russians were worried that they were going to get rolled over in the south. They could get 20 or 30,000 men trapped on the wrong side of the Dnieper River in a place called Kherson in the south, and that the Ukrainians would then roll on Crimea, which is Ukrainian land, unless you're Vladimir Putin, in which case it's just as Russian as St. Petersburg, and that Putin had visions, I think, in this time period of the Russian army collapsing in the way that it collapsed in 1917. And we know he thinks like this because he talked about that a year later in the context of the Prigozhin mutiny. And so there were real concerns in the U.S. intelligence community that if the Russian army collapsed in the south in the southern part of Ukraine in the fall of 2022, that the Russians would resort to the battlefield use of tactical nuclear weapons. And maybe people, think that is crazy. Maybe people dismiss that, like, the Russians would never think about doing that, except Russian doctrine does contemplate the use of low-yield nuclear weapons for warfighting purposes. And if the intelligence community comes into the President of the United States and says, hey, boss, if the Russians collapse in the South, there's a 50% chance, a coin flip, that the Russians will use nuclear weapons. It's the obligation of the President of the United States, one of the only two people on planet Earth that can destroy the human race with a push of a button, to take those types of things seriously. So I think those would be the three aspects of magical thinking that bugged me the most. But it's not that I have strong feelings about any of this stuff.
Well, there's a lot of great stuff there, and at some point I want to turn back to you and ask, because one of the things that I saw out of the article was when you were talking about the fall of 22, some of the tensions that emerged in the relationship between Ukraine and the United States, and some of the debates about what was to be done in 2023. But I want to turn to John and to the perspective of how things looked in London, because of course, this was an article in an American paper. The British role was perhaps underplayed just because of the audience, but we all know that the Prime Minister you're working for was one of the people out in front, sort of rallying support for doing things for Ukraine, was the first really to go to Kyiv, and this is something you were involved in. So I wonder if you could talk about the perspective both on the piece and also from your sense of what people get right and what they get wrong from the perspective of London at that time moving forward.
Thank you, Frank, and pleasure to be here and part of this conversation. Just the first thing to say, as a historian or an academic, someone who's taught some of this, before I went into government, it is quite striking, just a reflection, that you have a kind of cadre of top, primarily US investigative journalists who take the post 9/11 period, have often done that first draft of history. So there's Thomas Ricks, there's Steve Cole, there's David Sanger. Those are some of the most authoritative books, and that snapshot's actually really quite important. It's going to take historians a while to get back to some of this, and as Jana said, they have fragments of conversations that are not necessarily in the archives. So I think there's a really impressive tradition, and this article fits within that. You will expect me to say, and I will say it, that the UK or the European role is kind of downplayed a little bit. It's interesting the piece starts by having one of these key US officials actually driven around by a British commando, it says somewhere at the top of the piece, and then this is sort of dissipates in the story. But as you also know, and we've had this conversation many times, that's not me at all playing down the significance of the US role. And the single definitive strategic fact in Ukraine's resistance against Russia, and by the way, European security, is the importance and power of the United States. And that is vivid in both the quantum and scale of material that's sent in, with the various congressional supplementals, but above all in ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. America controls the skies. In some places, Elon Musk, by the way, controls the skies. So the significance of that fact is really profound in everything. So where do allies and partners fit in with this? My sort of main reflection on the piece, which is that, and Colin sort of debated through some of the decision-making processes, is just how contingent a lot of this is in terms of the response. So the piece kind of gets a snapshot or a couple of snapshots of a moment in time in which very tense international or bilateral US-Ukraine, we were intimately involved in the UK case, debates over the right capabilities, which was a moving target the whole time, and Colin will testify to that, over permissions, so the way and the extent to which intelligence is used with what definitions. Sharon's talked about target, persons of interest, or etc. Those debates all kind of happen from month to month, often in sort of set piece moments, up to a moment when there's a particular crisis, incident, an international summit, very, very contingent. And my overall view in the piece, which is a point I've made before, but I think is really quite important, the whole extent of the Western response, let's call it the Western response, is contingent on a number of things that I think historians have a duty to sort of put into the mix in terms of consideration. There was no test book or copybook for how the response would pan out. The primary anxiety in the lead up to the invasion was the extent to which Western unity would hold. I actually think Western unity held remarkably well on a range of issues. The G7 actually went further than the G7 thought it would do on a range of things like sanctions, in terms of military support, etc. But no one could see, the nature of the thing. Now, obviously, that Western unity is under strain for a lot of reasons, but there was nothing inevitable about that. So the story, as I say, is US power oversight with some hyperactive actions by key European allies. But the next question is actually, it's much more messy than that. It's going back to, we have an open debate, which Colin might want to comment on, as to whether what happened in Afghanistan, the experience of that may have affected Biden administration thinking at a certain level in different parts of the system. It certainly was part of our thinking. Structurally, such was the shock at the end of Afghanistan. Just literally how we organised the government response changed. So we went from sort of primarily doing it as known through the link door into the cabinet office where the National Security Secretariat at, to pulling everything to number 10 in terms of the crisis response. There's the role of different individual European leaders in the time and place, and my Prime Minister in the initial period was Boris Johnson, although that changed twice, actually 3 times over a different time, and each of those Prime Ministers had a kind of robust response, but a different way of thinking about things. So the types of policy dilemmas that Colin described, where you reach this moment in the piece, I think are quite important, but some Prime Ministers it was instinctive. Some of them in terms of, we had all the same debates because we're part of the same intelligence network on escalation, and it was a factor in our considerations. I think Colin makes a really good point. It's inevitably going to be more of a factor for the United States than it is for many other powers. Quite a high factor for us because we're also nuclear armed power as well, so we're part of that conversation as well. But the ultimate responsibility is in Washington, D.C., and I think that's an important consideration because there was frustration in our system sometimes that why can't you move further and faster. So all those ingredients were there, but some Prime Ministers, when they looked at the problem, or some ministers when they looked at the problem, went from gut, went from history, often made quite interesting snap judgments, or very fascinatingly, as a kind of policy wonk myself, simplified the scenario in front of us in actually a really quite powerful way, in the way that the sort of policy community wouldn't naturally get to. Other leaders, ministers, prime ministers, at different snapshots, looked at the battlefield assessments, looked at the economic projections, needed more data in terms of the decision-making process. But the whole thing far more contingent, far more messy. Having sat in a lot of the G7 calls in the sort of build-up and invasion, I was sort of, the eventual G7 response exceeded my expectations in having sat in those calls. People were in very different places. There's a famous Joe Biden comments about different types of invasion scenarios, much maligned and criticized. I think President Biden said something along the lines, well, there's a difference between a full-scale invasion and little green men, and European responses to the little green men or hybrid war actually been pretty inadequate previously as well. I think the biggest factor is the visual nature and the scale of this in a European sense really kind of shocked everyone. This is a kind of utterly Second World War moment, and no one necessarily saw it coming like that. So as I say, shock factor, intra-alliance dynamics, all those different things. Just one thing to add, because I think in the UK we were engaged in a version of the US policy debate right up in the summer preceding, and we had huge debates internally about what types of lethal weaponry or equipment, and by the way, would we use the phrase lethal weaponry? I always put in the Prime Minister's speech as defensive equipment for Ukraine. And our stinger was the NLAWs, the anti-tank missiles built in Belfast, my hometown, which actually became really symbolically, and actually seriously effective. No one really knew that would be the case either, in terms of what capabilities were needed, but that build-up kind of happened there. So we kind of broken the seal. We were in a kind of robust space by the late summer of 21, really, in many respects. So we were sort of in some respect better prepared for some of the policy debates that came after. But mass contingency, it's even more complicated, is my sort of headline response.
This is great. I think one of the things that both you and Colin on this very much goes along with the article is that if you were to take a historical lens on this is actually remarkable, some of the successes that happened, the coordination, the doing more than was expected, the rallying effect, which comes out very clearly in the article and things that you've said. But I want to turn to Ian, because you have better contacts in Europe than just about anyone I know. And I was with you a lot of the time during this period, and that wasn't always the reaction among Europeans, right? And there's a couple specifics on that. Colin's point about how we were making decisions, John's point about the contingency and pulling us all together. One had the sense in Europe that the U.S. and the British were not doing enough, that something was being held back, that this was, and another very controversial thing, because I don't want to keep this not controversial, that comes through clearly through the article, and I know from conversations with Colin this is the case. In 2023, the Ukrainians were beyond sin, right? One of the things I think that's most surprising about this article is that the Ukrainians are not without sin throughout all this. They're under enormous pressure, you can understand mistakes, but this was not the view in Europe. And so I wondered how you, while it was happening and you're sort of assessing and reading the article and thinking about Ukraine's role in this, Zelensky, Yarmak, and how Europe itself assessed, reacted, thought about what the U.S. and the Brits were doing, and then how it's sort of maybe mapped with a more sober reality that comes out in the article, if that's fair. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's a myth, and I look back at journalism that was written at the time, just in preparation for this, and it's terrific to be here, and thank you very much to Janice for hosting. And actually, if you look at the time of peak invasion, in press terms, it's about almost the collapse of the West.
Right.
So a few people were saying, come on, the West can rally. But actually, journalism was in a sort of state of panic about it as well, how to interpret it. I was very struck, though, by what John said there about, I want to say just something about the journalism as a journalist and, as a former newspaper editor in a previous life, is that style of American journalism, in that rather brilliant piece, I think there's a real danger we kind of take it for granted, actually. And it's something as a journalist that we think of having been there forever, but it really develops in the 1970s. It's not 100 years old, that way of telling stories. And when the American media gets its real kind of financial clout and cultural clout in the 60s and 70s, newspapers become much grander, they then invest in this kind of journalism. And that's the idea on the Journal or the Post of taking reporters off for long periods, not just on national security, but on finance as well, and enabling them to do the deep dive, which sometimes as Europeans we would laugh at American journalists who would have to produce 2 long pieces a year. But the reality is that means you get this kind of journalism. And I remember experiencing it as a writer, as an editor, kind of being in awe post-Iraq War of that form of American journalism. And you mentioned Ricks, but that extraordinary book, Fiasco, and various other books in the immediate aftermath which captured it. Now, the reason I mention that is that we should be worried if it disappears. And I've a feeling that with what's happening to US media dynamics at the moment, to put it politely, plus the cratering of the traditional media model, there's less and less of this. There's actually very little of this kind of piece in Europe now. And if we are going through this world of turmoil, and historians are looking for, you want to be able to draw on this first draft of history stuff, people need to start thinking in a serious, organized way, foundations, etc., about how it's funded. Because it's not, you can't always rely on the New York Times or Wall Street Journal. I mean, maybe they'll be fine, but there's a potential deficit there. But yeah, just on your European point, I mean, the other thing that fascinates me, to which I don't have the answer, but I've thought about a lot, is this question of European unity. And the thing had a media cycle of chaos in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. The story was the West is divided, about to be humiliated again. And you had the kind of, you had the, I suppose you had the context of, Middle East and Afghanistan as well. Then this rallying, and a lot of hype really from Europe. You know, a lot of speeches about how united Europe was, and Europe would get its act together, which you know, is the oldest and emptiest of phrases about European politics. Europe is finally going to get its act together. What does that actually mean? And if you fast forward to now, I mean, I don't want to be melodramatic about it, but you have a Europe which is deeply divided on this question, and divided in ways which are not kind of widely understood. I mean, it's effectively divided in 3 or 4 different directions. And maybe that doesn't come across in the US, but you'd put the Brits, maybe John would agree with this, in one camp and being really robust. I'm talking about what happens next in Ukraine. Then you have a group of countries who want that to be the case, but suspect that there's a settlement coming and that actually the accommodation will have to be grubbier than desired. Then others who think, well, come on, there's going to have to be some kind of accommodation with the Russians, right through to certain states which are actively pro-Russian. So I'm interested in the you know, the political rhetoric, how the media has handled it. But I think we have a divided Europe in terms of where we go next on Ukraine and Russia.
Your point about journalism, which backs up what John said as contemporary history, I hadn't really thought about it. And we obviously are in a period now, both because of the economics and structure of how the information is delivered, where that's under threat. And we can imagine, particularly in the world we're in now, how it's more needed than ever. I hadn't thought about the post-Iraq and all the great books that had come out that sort of highlighted this. Sergey, the question I'm going to ask you is a bit unfair because, but you've just been you're the Gelber Prize winner, so I feel like I can be a little bit unfair. We've gotten to here, we have the privilege here of hearing this extraordinarily detailed account of people who participated in these consequential decisions. We have this wonderful deep dive newspaper article, and Ian has pointed out how rare and perhaps fleeting something like this is. You've just completed an extraordinary book that looks at Soviet decision making, right? Through looking at the archives, starting at the start of World War II, going through to the end of the Cold War, reconstructing, developing ideas about how they saw things, giving a real insider's view of how the why they pursued the policies they did. And this is the unfair part, because you've also participated in some of these contemporary debates. If you were to speculate on there's obviously no independent press left in Moscow, but if you were to imagine what a similar article done in Moscow would look like, if you were to say, what would be the secret, I mean, again, a lot of times with historians, we're faced with the lack of resources and sources, but would you even begin to speculate at what that might look like, even how you would, or would you say, we just can't know, I can't get the sources? But if you were to say, what would the secret history of Russia's war in Ukraine from the Russian perspective, an article look like? What would you, if you were to just speculate and guess, understanding that it's speculation?
Well, thank you, Frank, and of course it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Janice, for organizing all of this. I feel very privileged to be the cause for bringing us all together as the winner of this year's Gelber's Prize. So thank you very much, Frank. We have had this issue of assessing Putin's motivations, understanding what's going on in Moscow. And because of the lack of access, because it's difficult now for people to go there, even people like me, I know the language, I know the culture. It's very difficult to really understand what's going on. And I worry about this. I worry about the decline of expertise on Russia. I worry about the decline of access to Russia, because we can speculate about what they think from the outside by reading their propaganda, but often propaganda only takes you that far. You try to then form a picture by speaking to individuals who are still in Russia thinking, hoping that they have some kind of insights, and most of the time they're also captured by propaganda narratives and don't have really anything sensible to say. I have faced this problem myself while working on issues related to Ukraine, in particular on the Istanbul peace process in terms of access and just talking to the Russians, because you get stonewalled, people fear, they're afraid to talk to you because they face repercussions. If something if something went wrong, then they could end up in prison for years and years, or fall out of the window accidentally. So my hopes for something like that sort of journalism existing in Russia are not very high. We used to have a moment in the 90s where you could actually do this sort of things in Russia, where you had Russian journalists who would go into Chechnya and explore what the regime was doing there, report on that extensively. And then, of course, one of the first things that Putin did when he came to power was to crack down on the independent media, and journalists were sometimes killed, brutally murdered. In other instances, were simply just told to shut up. And so we are in this situation where you cannot really know what's going on. You can only speculate. Even people like me who are supposed to know their stuff, I find that the longer I stay outside of Russia, the less I understand what's going on there. That is actually a tragic situation. I hope we can, eventually move in a more profitable direction. Going now to this article, one thing for me that I found quite, I wouldn't say super striking, but really interesting is obviously the whole extent of American and Western involvement in the especially early phases of war. To me, after reading this article, it becomes absolutely clear that Ukraine would have likely lost the war except for that sort of involvement, which is very interesting because you, of course, had Putin's, I'm a great consumer of Putin's speeches. I follow him, and obviously one of the ways trying to understand what Putin is thinking is to see what he's saying. And he's been on about it for a long time. He's been complaining about it. Well, we're fighting this war against NATO, etc. And that you can take that as propaganda, which is certainly to a certain extent it is, of course, because I think if Russia was truly fighting a war with NATO, it would be in deep, deep, deep trouble. But I think there is a point there in the sense that he probably understood that Western involvement was much greater than the declared involvement at that time. And I think through this article we can see the extent of this involvement and the true impact of that on the situation on the battlefronts. Truly, you can say, with all, of course, respect for the bravery of Ukrainian soldiers and for their commitment to the future of their country, which is obviously the key reason why Ukraine was able to hold on. I think clearly Western and in particular American involvement was absolutely essential to Ukraine being able to hold on. Now, if I were to just highlight one thing that struck me in the article more than anything else, it was this part where there's a discussion about the American frustration that the Ukrainians are not willing to send young people to the front lines, because to me that highlighted something that I've been thinking about for a long time and I've been trying to wrestle with, and that is the question of the existentiality of this conflict. And actually Colin just mentioned that the war clearly was existential for Ukraine. I mean, if Ukraine lost that war in those early weeks, there would be no Ukraine as we know it, right? It was an existential war. Even so, it was striking for me that the Ukrainian government was then and still is reluctant to send, let's say, 18 to 25-year-olds to the front lines for whatever reason. And they have their narrative, they have their story to tell. They say, well, we don't want to do that because that's the future of Ukraine, and you understand that. On the other hand, you would think, well, if that's an existential war for you, then why is that the case? But just to, while I still think the war is existential for Ukraine, I would say anytime that I hear that the war is existential for anybody else, I do have my doubts, and I have had conversations with folks in Europe in particular, and some actually very senior people at NATO who would say, this war is existential for Europe, or this war is existential for the United States. And Frank, you asked about the narratives and how some of those narratives may not, what narratives you disagree with, etc. And I find that particular narrative a little bit difficult to understand, because I think that that the war is not existential for the United States. There's obviously the United States is interested in helping Ukraine survive and retain its agency as an independent state. I don't think it's existential for the United States. For the Europeans, I don't know. And here, in the end, you talked about the different perspectives of different European countries, and you might say, well, this war is existential for the Baltics or Poland. Even there, I have certain doubts, maybe less existential for certain other countries in Europe. But one thing that you have to reflect on is this: if this war is existential for everybody and how this is going to change everything, etc., then why have the Europeans been so slow in building up their defensive capacity? And why, for example, in Britain, we're having this debate about going from, 2% to 2.5% or 2.7%, and this is seen as incredibly just gigantic deal. I mean, if you're talking about an existential conflict, you could at least go to the spending of the time of the Cold War. You look at some other countries in Europe, and you still have NATO member states who are not even meeting the 2% target, right? So that is where I have my certain doubts. And we also have heard that the war, certainly the Russian regime seems to project this image that the war is existential for Russia, and maybe it is to a certain extent. I don't know if Putin can survive losing this war, maybe he can. But again, in Russia's case as well, one of the striking things is that the Russians have not really have not declared a general mobilization to fight this war and have been trying to hire people. We have just heard that Chinese nationals have been captured on the Ukrainian front, because they obviously sign up and get paid for by the Russian government. So all of that is just seems to project a very different story.
But just on the European point, I think you get absolutely to the heart of it, but I think it's down to a style of European politics, which is, I've been trying to think of a term for it. It's a kind of like high symmetry style that politics, compared to say 50 or 100 years ago, it lends itself to endless meetings out of which you come and you have to give a statement. Kind of rolling meetings of European Union, NATO meetings, and you have to say something that sounds inspirational and unified in a way that the Brits weren't giving those kind of giving a running commentary in the late 1930s while they were rearming. It almost becomes a substitute for action. And as you say,
can I take up on this, because I have a question for all of you that both these comments go really well, and I want each of you to talk about this, because you've highlighted nicely the dilemmas of doing contemporary history, and there's a couple of them, right? One is Ian's point, and I think this came out really nicely in what Colin was talking about, was John was talking about, where the action is, right? Where are the decisions that are being made, where are they that matter, right? And we often realize that what you read in the newspapers, it isn't these meetings. Colin and John could probably talk to all sorts of meetings that weren't G7 meetings, but were behind the scenes, that were based on people knowing each other. So this is a challenge as you're trying to put this together. That's kind of challenge one. Challenge two is, and this came up a lot in the difference between good policy and good politics, right? So a lot of the gap in all of this, we could sit here and say, when I hear John and Colin lay out what happened, and when I read the piece, I think, this is, on the range of policy outcomes, this is extraordinary, right? But when you think about the politics, less so, right? In every country, okay in Britain, less good in DC, really problematic in Europe. And so how you think about that. And then the final thing on contemporary history is, it's what Sergei said about when we tell stories about the past, there's a narrative arc. There's all sorts of problems with that. One is that there's good guys and bad guys. And you've all hinted at this, is in the article, who's the good guys, who's the bad guys. No one is all good, no one is all bad. But also we know how the story ends, which gets to the final thing. We don't know how the story ends. So I guess, one, your comments on how to assess these complicated consequential things as they're happening and making sense of them, giving all the dilemmas. And two, incredibly unfair, but where is this story going? Where are we meet 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Is the story complete? What does the narrative arc look like? Why don't we start with you, Janice? I'll give everyone, this will be
About 2 or 3 minutes. Okay. One of the wonderful things about a narrative arc is you can reason back from the end.
Yes.
And you can take the messiness that you talked about, John, that Colin talked about, and that I think is a distinguishing virtue of the article, the messiness, the contingency. All of that falls out of the history that gets written. And it's human, by the way. It's how we all think. Once we know where we landed, we can draw a straight line back, and all the noise that we had to cope with is gone. So I think a great virtue of contemporary history is it keeps the messiness in. It makes history more contingent, to use your word, John, more complex. You know, Colin talked about myths that have grown up, and I have great sympathy for all the 3 myths that you identified, Colin. Those are real life dilemmas, and when you look at the questions of the people in the Pentagon were asking that day, they weren't, is this war existential? It was, what do we have on the shelf, and what can we send without exposing ourselves somewhere else in the world? Nobody's going to write the history that way once they know the end of this. And a piece that if we had a whole day to talk, and maybe we will do that because this is so rich, but the piece that we haven't talked about at all is how important domestic Ukrainian politics were here. The infighting that was going on among Ukrainian generals, which was barely visible in anything that we read, how important friendships were between an American general and a Ukrainian general, how much those guys were able to get done, because they liked each other and trusted each other, and when that was removed from the equation, how important, which leads me to a bigger question that historians write about it, but they write about it in a funny way, in all honesty, how important your local ally is. And what comes out in the piece, and I'd be shocked if Colin didn't feel this at certain points, is the tail wagging the dog here. And we are making this effort. We are doing A, B, C, D, and E. But the Ukrainians, and this, it comes out just in the articles, a hint of it, but this is their war. They have to make these decisions. But it's not the big decision. It's not an existential war. It's this decision today about where to move these forces. And the absolute shock that, I mean, that was the highlight to me, the piece, where he said, where one of the American generals said, that's not the plan we agreed to. And that changes the course, frankly, of that long-awaited counteroffensive. But it's the most local decision made on the ground. And nobody in London and nobody in Washington, frankly, gets a whiff of that before it happens. That's why contemporary history is so valuable.
I want to get to Colin on that, because Colin, I've given these broader questions, but this is, I think, the thing that I took away from the piece, that tension, that stress, Janice's point about who you knew locally, what's going on in domestic Ukrainian politics, the level of frustration that is often felt on the American side, but also a recognition this is Ukraine's war, and how I think Janice is right that dynamic hasn't been captured. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, also your ideas about how it mattered, how things might have been different, why it wasn't captured, and then some of these broader questions of contemporary history.
Well, look, I think that, and it goes to an earlier comment, the war was not existential for the United States. There was a high degree of overlap in the vital national interest between the United States and Ukraine. Like the Venn diagram was probably 90%, but it wasn't 100%. For Ukraine, it was existential. Now, whether, to Sergei's point, they always acted like it, sometimes it seems like on the mobilization front, they didn't, but they mostly did. But for the United States, it wasn't existential. What would be existential is stumbling into World War III with the Russians, right? So I think, and it's that 10% of non-overlap that I think explains a lot of the tensions. And frankly, it also explains some tensions that we had with the Europeans, who, whether it's frontline European states who wanted to like hold our coat while we did stuff with the Russians, or even our British friends who are a little gung ho at times, who are a nuclear power and our closest allies in the world, but also don't have the same level of global responsibility that the United States does to the survival of the human race. So anyway, I think what part of this is that the Venn diagrams were highly overlapping but not identical. So that's thing one. The second thing is that there were a lot of benefits to how the United States helped the Ukrainians. You know, most of the conversation in Washington and in Europe focused on things, on kit, weapon systems, artillery, those types of things. Not a lot of emphasis until this article and a handful of others on actually how much the information and advice that we provided behind the scenes to the Ukrainians really enabled them to decimate what looked to be the second best military in the world. And at very little cost to the United States. Obviously, no lives directly lost. The $60-70 billion in military assistance is a lot of money, but it's still kind of a rounding error on the U.S. defense budget over that 3-year period. And if you could say you could basically work indirectly through a partner to inflict 750,000 casualties on the second best military in the world, and all the while manage the risk of nuclear escalation and avoid any direct cost to yourselves in terms of blood, that's a pretty good strategic bargain. So the benefit is that doing this indirectly lowers the cost to the United States and our and other folks not directly involved, and manages escalation. But the cost of doing it indirectly is control. Like, at the end of the day, A, it's not our war, it's the Ukrainians' war, and B, they had more at stake because it was existential for them and not us. So the frustrations that you see in the article, and it was lived daily, is that, like, we could give them our advice, but at the end of the day, we couldn't tell them what to do. And that's replicated in other places too. You could tell a version of that story with the United States and Israel that would be not completely dissimilar. So anyway, I just think that's a general problem that we've had. Can I just say two things about kind of like looking back, where I think we are? I think there was this question about like where are we going, or I would just say two things. One, the bad news is I don't see Ukraine re-seizing their territory. The front lines have not meaningfully changed in a couple of years. And I don't think Ukraine is going to get back their territory anytime in the foreseeable future. That's the bad news. The good news is Russia, I do not think, is capable of conquering Ukraine. And they're both because they haven't been willing to mobilize, but also because they couldn't beat Ukraine when Ukraine was weak. They're not going to be able to beat Ukraine when Ukraine's one of the best armies in Europe. So I think we're basically in a period of stalemate, and whether that is stalemate with a kind of grinding attrition at the front, or it's stalemate that's instantiated in some armistice or a ceasefire, I don't know. But I think we are in a period of stalemate that's not likely to change. The second thing I think, looking back, is that first year of the war, with all of the leadership that the United States demonstrated, I think in part to redeem itself from Afghanistan, to the point made earlier, and also to demonstrate that the United States could lead in a global crisis, that was the peak of Western unity. And that for reasons that are becoming increasingly obvious, there are, most of the camps, the foreign policy camps in the United States, especially in the Trump administration, but not exclusively, deprioritize Europe to prioritize either China or the American homeland or the Western Hemisphere. But Europe is pretty far down the list. And given the huge domestic political swings in the United States, just the degree of reliability as an ally for the United States just can't, you can't predict it beyond 4 or 8 year cycles. And so you have to plan that every 4 or 8 years, the United States is, at the very least, the United States is going to be fundamentally unreliable. And I just think that is going to scramble the Western alliance system. It doesn't mean the alliances collapse. It just means it'll be fundamentally more brittle and contingent, to Janice's point. And so I think we were at peak West in 2022, 2023, and we are no longer in peak West.
Well, with this expert panel, we could go on and on and on and on, so many things. But I'm gonna give John the final word before we take out here. And something that Colin was talking about Peak West. You were both involved in this extraordinary transformation in terms of British grand strategy, but also in the world. But as a scholar, you've written about transition moments in world order. Your incredible book on Casterly and Vienna, your book on Attlee at a time when the basic contract of order in the United Kingdom was rewritten. And so this again might be unfair, but are we at one, do you feel both as a participant and a scholar that if Colin's right, we had Peak West in the first year of the war, and we're clearly in something different now. You both you participate in it, but as a scholar who has studied these kind of ordering and disordering moments, where are we, right? And how do you make sense of it? And again, no one's going to hold you, responsible, because this is a very, very difficult question.
We'll come back
But-
in 5 years.
Yeah, but how are you thinking about this?
I thought I was going to get into existential philosophy for a moment, and you've given me a difficult question. Interesting, on existential, we heard the word used in our political discussions, cabinet discussions as well. I kind of shared a similar instinct. I think it's just a word that politicians reach for sometimes that means very important. Yeah. Right, and so this is why it's so messy. Everyone's saying it's existential, but I'm being the academic in the back of the room. I think that's important. And then Colin, point taken on the Brits being sometimes a little bit bullshit. I sometimes compared our position to Scrappy-Doo, where you guys are Scooby-Doo, which is necessary. So we understand very much that dynamic as well.
You've single-handedly brought Scrappy-Doo back as a thing. I expect kids to be wearing these shirts.
Is it still on TV? Who knows? Even the Peak West was even more peaky West than this, and this is something that actually is really quite significant because of G7 mobilization, because of the way NATO did its 3 partnerships with South Korea, Australia, Japan, because of concerns in that world around supply chains, so accentuated by COVID, some inward investment, etc., critical minerals. Actually, we all wanted administration to go further on some of the sort of economic alliance, tech alliance side of things. That felt really quite significant. There was a high degree of alignment with US grand strategy that was not inevitable post-Afghanistan. And it was built not simply around Ukraine as well. And my worry is that some of that concept that there was indivisibility between these two theaters is frayed. And there's reasons why countries in the Indo-Pacific bought into it, and there's reasons why countries in Europe bought into it. And here's a point on sort of military metrics, and it helps begin to answer your question. So Frank, I think the clue to the answer to the 3 big questions, like how do we understand this, what comes next, and are we in this sort of transition moment, what comes next for Ukraine, and are we in this transition moment, is the primacy of politics. I'm going to stress them. But what I mean by that is, the messier elements of democratic politics. It's still remarkable, and I cannot get my head around the sort of village effect of support for Ukraine in the UK. The polling is remarkably consistent. You go anywhere in a British pub in County Kent to up in Newcastle to Northern Ireland, you have these Ukrainian flags everywhere. Something very simple clicked. I also think it is strategic enough to have had primarily a political response to what happened, which is this act of aggression is not okay, and it's strategic enough to resist it. Whole question about how you resist it, how much you pile in, how much risk you take, that is strategic enough for me. So Colin's kind of woven an even bigger strategic argument that in the process, in the Pentagon, some wise heads are thinking we're running down a potential threat to the Western alliance as well, but there is enough to push back. That is strategic enough and vital and important, and being involved in that decision is important without any sense of endgame. Primacy of politics, also you take Ukraine, so Janice mentioned domestic issues. I remember being there in Ukraine in the lead up to the war on a couple of occasions, and Zelensky telling us it wasn't going to happen, we couldn't get our head around it. Zelensky's managing his own internal politics, feels collapse, feels capital flight, doesn't feel his government is particularly strong at that moment in time. He's managing that. Then everyone said, this is coming, it's coming hard, and you're in massive trouble. In a couple of weeks, it's going to collapse. Get out, create a government in exile. He made the absolutely crucial decision against the better advice of a lot of countries. Actually, not our advice was stay in. Remember the Me Too moment in the streets of Kyiv? We're still here. So all those things are kind of very, and actually he played a blinder for a significant period of time. He played an absolute blinder. It's just very hard in politics to keep playing that blinder and not fall off at occasion time, because he was a high risk strategy. He was coaxing all of us at certain points. Even the Brits sometimes felt, oh, we're getting too much pressure here. Oh my gosh, he's turned up asking for airplanes now, and but it was skill. So the primacy of politics, I think, begins to answer the world order question. So I mean, and I don't have an IR theory answer to this. My instinct is that some new equilibrium will be found. We're in the period of the turmoil and the tumult, but history tells you that's not always the case. So think of the period before the First World War, which I think interests me more and more, not the Sleepwalker thesis, so I love that book. To my mind, the story of Britain and its allies and partners in the lead up to the First World War is the failure to deepen sufficiently its new alliance partnerships. So we broke from splendid isolation. We scrambled around. The first European-Asian alliance was the Anglo-Japanese alliance. We tried one with Russia. We tried an Anglo-French entente. They didn't go deep enough, and they weren't resilient enough to deter the world crisis, right? So it's a kind of completely different lesson. We didn't go deep enough. We didn't go for the alliance systems. And I think that's the one that's on the back of my mind. There's obviously the build up to the Second World War, which everyone talks about now as well. So my instinct tells me an equilibrium will be found, but every time I read the newspapers every single morning, it's like we're still on this carousel, and the carousel's been unhinged from the ground, and the carousel's now spinning in the air. Maybe so. And there are periods in which actually things don't find an equilibrium, and there's a cascading crisis or a multi-contingent crisis. So, but I think, and in the answer, what's the answer? It's politics again. It's doggedness, it's ingenuity, it's imagination, it's hard work, it's risk appetite, it's rethinking alliances. It's basically coming to some cold, hard choices. Here's the secret I can now sort of say, it's not a secret, which is the European position, the robust European position, has changed on Ukraine. It's not. I mean, it's in all public legal documents, full territorial integrity. What it now really is make sure this peace that the Trump administration is negotiating is as good as possible for Ukraine, and enough cement and an alternative choice in future and minimum coercion for those parts of Ukraine is ensured. That's the strategy. Pile everything on that scenario. Now, that's not the strategy we were pursuing in week 6, week 8, year 1, year 2. So some of those hard choices are crystallizing before us. But again, primacy of politics. Choice. Structural forces, yes. Military metrics, yes. Alliance, choice, trust, ingenuity. And I think there are massive choices to be made. I don't have great confidence that the right choices are made. But I still think there's a hell of a lot to play for. Is my final half optimistic.
That's an extraordinary insight, and the idea of whether we reach an equilibrium or whether that equilibrium is elusive, and we're in one of those periods where that image will stay with me for a while. The carousel flying off into space is why doing this kind of contemporary history is so important. It's been an extraordinary discussion. We are so grateful to our host, Janice, for bringing us all together, for putting this together, and so I will have you lead us out.
Just a final word. First of all, thank you to all of you, and thank you, Colin, for getting up. I don't know whether you're in the east or the west, but if it's the west, it's very, very early in the morning.
Peak West.
Peak West, exactly.
I'm in Peak West, yeah.
You're in Peak West, that's right.
I think that's his new nickname. If he becomes a rapper, we're going to call him Peak West.
Peak West. I did say to Frank that I thought there was so much meat here that we should try to get this group together again. And I'm absolutely convinced after this discussion that there are 4 or 5 big thematic ideas that all 6 of us have slightly different perspectives on, so we will. But I just do want to conclude with a thank you to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Their team provided the production. We will jointly send it out to everybody as a collaborative project with the Kissinger Center at the School of Advanced International Studies for Johns Hopkins. And I will say personally, this is the first installment with this group. I'm looking forward to the next one. Thank you all.